In the forgotten town of Aurora Springs, where compassion's echo seemed to have faded over the years, a tiny baby named Elias was left in a wicker basket at the doorstep of an old church. As night fell, an imposing black horse named Orion appeared, his presence defying logic. He approached the basket, his eyes gleaming with a mixture of curiosity and determination. Something inexplicable drew him to this vulnerable child, and with a gentle movement, he carried the baby on his back, beginning a journey that would change both their destinies. The church bells tolled midnight as Orion's hooves clicked against the cobblestone streets. The old building's facade loomed behind them, its weathered stones holding countless untold stories. Elias, barely a few days old, nestled securely in the makeshift sling Orion had created with his mané. The horse moved with a grace that belied his size, each step carefully measured to ensure the infant's safety. Aurora Springs was a town that time seemed to have forgotten. Once a bustling hub of activity, it had slowly declined over the decades, leaving behind empty storefronts and quiet streets. The church, St. Michael's, stood as a silent sentinel, its doors rarely opened except for the occasional service. Father Thomas, the aging priest, had long since given up on the idea of his flock returning in droves. He spent his days tending to the small garden behind the church, finding solace in the growth of his vegetables rather than in the dwindling attendance of his parishioners. It was Father Thomas who had first heard the soft cries of baby Elias. He had been locking up for the night when the sound reached his ears, barely audible above the whisper of the wind. With arthritic hands, he had opened the heavy wooden doors to find the wicker basket, a note tucked beneath the blanket that swaddled the infant. "Please care for him. His name is Elias. May God watch over him," the note read in a hurried scrawl. Father Thomas had stood there, conflicted. The church could barely sustain itself, let alone care for an abandoned child. He had been about to call the local authorities when a gust of wind had extinguished the candles in the church, plunging everything into darkness. When he had finally managed to relight them, the basket was empty, and hoof prints led away from the church steps. Orion trotted through the empty streets, his black coat blending with the shadows. Streetlights flickered intermittently, casting an eerie glow on the pavement. The horse seemed to know exactly where he was going, his ears perked forward, alert to any potential danger. As they passed by the town square, the statue of Aurora Springs founder, Jeremiah Wells, loomed over them. Its outstretched arm, once a symbol of progress and hope, now seemed to be reaching for something long lost. Elias stirred in his makeshift cradle, letting out a soft whimper. Orion nickered gently, the vibrations of his body soothing the baby back to sleep. The few residents still awake at this late hour peered out from behind curtains, their eyes widening at the sight of the majestic horse carrying a tiny bundle. Mrs. Peterson, the town gossip, nearly dropped her evening tea as she watched Orion pass by her window. Mr. Johnson, the night watchman at the local bank, rubbed his eyes in disbelief, wondering if the lone beer he'd had with dinner was playing tricks on his mind. As Orion continued his journey, the landscape of Aurora Springs unfolded around them. They passed the old mill, its water wheel long since stilled, covered in moss and memories. The horses' hooves echoed off the walls of abandoned warehouses, remnants of a once thriving industrial district. Each building, each street corner held a piece of the town's history, a testament to both its former glory and its current state of decay. Yet, as Orion carried Elias through this landscape of faded dreams, there was a sense of renewal in the air. The stars above seemed to shine a little brighter, and a warm breeze carried the scent of hope. It was as if the very act of this unusual pair making their way through town was breathing new life into Aurora Springs. They passed by the old schoolhouse, its playground equipment rusted and overgrown. Orion paused for a moment, his gaze fixed on the empty swings swaying gently in the night breeze. It was almost as if he could see a future where children's laughter would once again fill this space, with Elias among them. As they approached the outskirts of town, the dilapidated buildings gave way to open fields. Fireflies danced in the tall grass, their soft light mirroring the stars above. Orion's pace slowed as they reached a crossroads. To the left, the road led out of town, towards the unknown. To the right, it curved back towards the heart of Aurora Springs. For a moment, the horse stood still, his head turned towards the open road. The wind ruffled his mané, carrying with it the promise of adventure and freedom. Elias stirred again, this time letting out a small sneeze. The sound seemed to echo in the quiet night, a reminder of the precious cargo Orion carried. With a soft snort, Orion turned to the right, back towards town. His decision was made. Whatever force had brought him to Elias, whatever cosmic alignment had led to this unlikely pairing, it was clear that their destinies were now intertwined with that of Aurora Springs. As they made their way back into town, the first hints of dawn began to color the sky. The town was still asleep, unaware of the miracle that had transpired in its streets. Orion's hooves struck the pavement with renewed purpose, each step bringing them closer to their destination. They passed by homes where families slept, oblivious to the extraordinary journey taking place outside their windows. They passed the town hall, its clock tower marking the passage of time, tick by tick, into a new era for Aurora Springs. They passed the local diner, where in a few hours, the first patrons would arrive, ordering their usual coffee and eggs, unaware that their town had been forever changed overnight. Finally, as the sun's first rays began to peek over the horizon, Orion and Elias arrived at their destination. The horse came to a stop in front of a building with a large red cross painted on its facade. The Aurora Springs General Hospital stood before them, its windows dark except for the emergency room entrance, where a soft light spilled out onto the sidewalk. Orion approached the automatic doors, which slid open with a soft hiss. He stepped into the fluorescent-lit waiting room, his hooves echoing on the linoleum floor. The night nurse, Sarah, looked up from her computer, her jaw dropping at the sight before her. For a moment, time seemed to stand still. Sarah blinked, trying to process what she was seeing. A massive black horse, standing proudly in the middle of the hospital waiting room, with a tiny baby nestled safely in its manere. Then, as if breaking a spell, Elias began to cry. The sound jolted Sarah into action. She rushed around the desk, her hands outstretched towards the infant. Orion lowered his head, allowing her to carefully extract Elias from his makeshift cradle. As Sarah cradled Elias in her arms, checking him for any signs of distress, Orion took a step back. His task was complete. He had delivered the child safely to those who could care for him. With one last look at the baby, the horse turned and walked out of the hospital, disappearing into the early morning light. Sarah, still holding Elias, rushed to the door, but Orion was nowhere to be seen. She looked down at the infant in her arms, then back at the empty street. A smile slowly spread across her face as she realized she had just witnessed something truly extraordinary. As she turned to take Elias to the pediatric ward, Sarah couldn't help but feel that this was just the beginning. Something magical had happened in Aurora Springs that night, something that would ripple through the town and change it forever. And it all started with a horse named Orion and a baby named Elias. As Orion traversed the deserted streets of Aurora Springs, the town's inhabitants, perplexed, observed the scene unfold. The air hung heavy with uncertainty, but also with a silent hope. The story unraveled in a crescendo of emotions as Orion, guided by a mysterious force, made his way to the local hospital, where Elias's life was about to change forever. The first rays of dawn were just beginning to paint the sky in hues of pink and gold as Orion's hooves echoed through the empty streets. Windows began to light up one by one, as if the town itself was slowly awakening to witness this extraordinary event. Mr. Thompson, the baker, was the first to spot them as he prepared to open his shop. He stood frozen, a bag of flour forgotten in his hands, as he watched the majestic black horse trot by with its precious cargo. "Martha, Martha, come quick," he called to his wife, his voice a mix of disbelief and excitement. Martha Thompson rushed to the window, her hair still in curlers, just in time to see Orion round the corner. Word spread quickly through Aurora Springs, as it often does in small towns. By the time Orion reached Main Street, a small crowd had begun to gather. They kept their distance, a mix of awe and caution holding them back. Children pointed and whispered, while adults debated among themselves about what they were seeing. Emma Johnson, the town librarian, was reminded of the old folk tales she used to read to the children during story time. "It's like something out of a fairy tale," she murmured to no one in particular, her eyes wide with wonder. As Orion passed the town hall, Mayor Frank Wilson stepped out onto the street, still in his bathrobe and slippers. He had received a flurry of phone calls from concerned citizens, each one more fantastical than the last. Now, faced with the reality before him, he found himself at a loss for words. "Well, I'll be," he muttered, watching as Orion continued his steady pace towards the hospital. The mayor's mind was already racing, trying to figure out how he would explain this to the town council, or worse, to the press if word got out beyond Aurora Springs. The crowd following Orion grew larger as they approached the hospital. People fell into step behind the horse, as if drawn by an invisible force. There was Mrs. Rodriguez from the flower shop, still wearing her apron. Old Mr. Jenkins hobbled along with his cane, determined not to miss whatever was about to happen. Even Father Thomas had made his way from the church, his weathered face a mix of concern and curiosity. As they neared the hospital, Dr. Rachel Carter was just arriving for her early morning shift. She had parked her car and was walking towards the entrance when she saw the crowd approaching. At first, she thought there must have been some sort of accident. But as she squinted against the rising sun, she made out the form of Orion at the head of the procession. "What in the world?" she breathed, her hand frozen on the door handle. She watched in amazement as Orion approached, his gait steady and purposeful. It was then that she noticed the small bundle nestled in his manner. Her medical training kicked in, and she rushed forward, her heart racing. "Everyone, please stay back," she called out to the crowd. "Give them some space." The townspeople obeyed, forming a wide circle around Orion and Dr. Carter. With gentle hands, Dr. Carter reached out to take Elias from Orion's back. The horse lowered his head, allowing her to carefully extract the baby. As soon as Elias was in her arms, Dr. Carter's professional instincts took over. She quickly assessed the infant, checking his breathing and color. "He seems okay, but we need to get him inside for a proper examination," she announced to the anxious crowd. She turned to go into the hospital, then paused, looking back at Orion. The horse stood still, his dark eyes fixed on Elias. There was an intelligence in those eyes that made Dr. Carter hesitate. You can come too," she found herself saying, hardly believing the words coming out of her mouth. But something told her that separating the horse from the baby would be a mistake. As Dr. Carter entered the hospital with Elias, Orion followed close behind. The automatic doors opened with a hiss, and for a moment, the horse paused, as if uncertain. But then, with a soft nickering sound, he stepped into the fluorescent-lit hallway. The scene inside the hospital was one of controlled chaos. Nurses and orderlies stopped in their tracks, staring open-mouthed at the horse calmly walking through their midst. Dr. Carter barked orders, her voice snapping them back to attention. "I need a pediatric team in exam room 1, stat. And someone call Dr. Lucia Peterson. Tell her it's an emergency." As they rushed Elias to the exam room, with Orion following close behind, the energy in the hospital shifted. There was a palpable sense of anticipation, as if everyone could feel that they were on the cusp of something extraordinary. Dr. Lucia Peterson arrived minutes later, her face flushed from running up the stairs. She had been about to leave after a long night shift when she received the call. As she entered the exam room and saw Orion standing quietly in the corner, her eyebrows shot up in surprise. "Rachel, what's going on? Why is there a horse in my exam room?" Dr. Carter quickly filled her in on the situation, her words tumbling out in a rush. Dr. Peterson listened, her expression shifting from skepticism to wonder as she heard the tale. As the two doctors worked to examine Elias, Orion watched attentively. Every time the baby cried, the horse would take a step forward, only to stop when Dr. Peterson raised a hand. "It's okay," she found herself saying to Orion, her voice soft and reassuring. "We're taking good care of him." Outside the hospital, the crowd had grown. News had spread throughout Aurora Springs, and it seemed like half the town had gathered in the parking lot. They stood in hushed groups, speculating about what was happening inside. Mayor Wilson had arrived, now fully dressed in his official capacity. He stood on the steps of the hospital, trying to maintain some semblance of order. "Folks, please, let's remain calm," he called out. "I'm sure we'll have answers soon." Inside, Dr. Peterson and Dr. Carter were amazed by what they were seeing. Despite the ordeal he must have been through, Elias was in perfect health. His vital signs were strong, and he showed no signs of exposure or neglect. "It's as if he was protected somehow," Dr. Peterson murmured, her eyes darting to Orion. As the examination continued, something strange began to happen. The machines monitoring Elias's vital signs started to show unusual readings. His heartbeat, while still strong, began to sync with an odd rhythm in the room. It took the doctors a moment to realize that it was matching the sound of Orion's breathing. Dr. Peterson's scientific mind struggled to make sense of what she was seeing. There was a connection between the horse and the baby that defied logical explanation. As a woman of science, she had always relied on facts and empirical evidence. But standing in that room, watching the interplay between Elias and Orion, she felt her worldview beginning to shift. "Rachel," she said quietly, "I think we're witnessing something miraculous." Dr. Carter nodded, her eyes wide. "What do we do?" Dr. Peterson took a deep breath. "We do our jobs. We make sure this baby is healthy and safe. And then we try to understand what's happening here." As the morning wore on, more tests were run, and more hospital staff came to witness the unusual scene in exam room 1. Word had spread throughout the hospital, and everyone found an excuse to pass by, hoping to catch a glimpse of the mysterious horse and the baby he had brought. Through it all, Orion remained a calm presence in the room. He stood quietly, his eyes never leaving Elias. When the baby cried, he would softly nicker, and inexplicably, Elias would calm down. By midday, Dr. Peterson had to admit that medically, there was nothing more they needed to do for Elias. The baby was healthy, well-fed, and seemingly unaffected by his unusual journey. "So what now?" Dr. Carter asked, voicing the question that was on everyone's mind. Dr. Peterson looked at Elias, peacefully sleeping in the hospital crib, then at Orion, standing guard nearby. She thought about the crowd outside, the town holding its breath, waiting for answers. She thought about everything she had seen that day, everything that challenged her understanding of the world. "Now," she said slowly, "now we have to decide what we believe in." At the hospital, Dr. Lucia Peterson, a dedicated but skeptical physician, found herself facing a challenge: saving the life of a baby who had inexplicably appeared at her doorstep. As she observed the connection between Orion and Elias, Lucia was forced to confront her own beliefs about what was possible and what lay beyond reason. While the medical team struggled to stabilize the baby, Lucia witnessed moments that defied logic, a gentle whisper of hope echoing through the emergency room. The fluorescent lights of the hospital corridor buzzed overhead as Dr. Lucia Peterson strode purposefully towards exam room 1. Her mind was racing, trying to reconcile the fantastical story she'd been told with her years of medical training and experience. As she pushed open the door, the scene that greeted her was unlike anything she had ever encountered in her career. Elias lay in a standard hospital crib, small sensors attached to his tiny body, monitoring his vital signs. But it was the presence of Orion, the massive black horse standing calmly in the corner of the room, that made Lucia pause mid-step. For a moment, she wondered if the lack of sleep from her long shift had finally caught up with her. "Dr. Carter," Lucia said, her voice tight with controlled professionalism, "can you please explain to me again what's going on here?" Dr. Rachel Carter, still looking somewhat shell-shocked herself, quickly recounted the events of the morning. As Lucia listened, her eyes kept darting between the baby and the horse, searching for some logical explanation. "And you're certain this horse, Orion, brought the baby here?" Lucia asked, her skepticism evident in her tone. "I know it sounds incredible," Rachel replied, "but I saw it with my own eyes. Half the town did." Lucia took a deep breath, centering herself. Whatever the circumstances, there was a patient who needed her attention. She approached the crib, her trained eyes quickly assessing Elias's condition. "Has he been examined thoroughly?" she asked, slipping on a pair of latex gloves. "Yes, Dr. Peterson. All preliminary tests show he's in perfect health, despite, well, everything." As Lucia began her own examination of Elias, she couldn't shake the feeling that something extraordinary was happening. The baby's vitals were indeed strong, his color good, and he showed no signs of distress. But there was something else, something she couldn't quite put her finger on. Suddenly, one of the monitors began to beep erratically. Elias's heart rate was spiking, his tiny face scrunching up as he prepared to cry. Lucia's hands moved swiftly, years of training kicking in as she prepared to address whatever was causing the distress. But before she could do anything, Orion let out a soft nicker. The sound was gentle, almost melodic, and to Lucia's astonishment, Elias immediately calmed. The monitor's beeping returned to normal, and the baby's face relaxed. Lucia stood frozen, her mind struggling to process what she had just witnessed. She turned to look at Orion, who was gazing at Elias with what she could only describe as concern in his large, dark eyes. "That's not possible," she muttered to herself. "It's been happening all morning," Rachel said softly. "Every time Elias gets upset, Orion seems to know exactly what to do to calm him down." Lucia shook her head, trying to clear it. There has to be a logical explanation. Perhaps the horse's presence is simply familiar to the baby, providing a sense of security. Even as she said it, Lucia knew her explanation fell short. There was something more happening here, something that challenged everything she thought she knew about medicine, about the connection between living beings. Over the next few hours, Lucia found herself constantly torn between her scientific training and the inexplicable events unfolding before her. She ran every test she could think of on Elias, looking for any medical explanation for his unusual bond with Orion. But each result only deepened the mystery. The baby's brain waves showed unusual patterns, syncing up with some undetectable rhythm in the room. When Lucia placed sensors near Orion, she was shocked to find that the horse's own biorhythms seemed to be influencing Elias's. "This is unprecedented," Lucia murmured, poring over the readouts. "It's as if they're communicating on some level we can't understand." As the day wore on, news of the miraculous baby and his equine guardian spread through the hospital. Staff members found excuses to pass by the exam room, hoping to catch a glimpse of the unusual pair. Lucia found herself fielding questions from curious colleagues, struggling to provide rational explanations for what was happening. Dr. Marcus Brennan, the head of pediatrics and Lucia's longtime rival, eventually made an appearance. His face was a mask of skepticism as he surveyed the scene. "Peterson, surely you're not buying into this nonsense," he scoffed. "A horse bringing in a baby? It's clearly some sort of hoax." Lucia bristled at his dismissive tone. "I don't know what it is, Marcus, but I know what I've seen. There's something happening here that we don't understand yet." "Don't tell me you're going soft on me, Lucia," Marcus sneered. "I thought you were a woman of science." His words stung, hitting at the very core of the internal struggle Lucia had been grappling with all day. She was a scientist, trained to trust in facts and empirical evidence. But she was also a doctor, sworn to do what was best for her patients. And something deep inside her was telling her that the connection between Elias and Orion was vital to the baby's well-being. As if to underscore her thoughts, Elias began to fuss again. Before any of the medical staff could react, Orion stepped forward, gently nuzzling the side of the crib. The touch seemed to soothe Elias instantly, his cries subsiding into soft coos. Marcus watched this interaction, his face a mixture of disbelief and frustration. "This is ridiculous. That animal is a health hazard. It needs to be removed immediately." "No." Lucia surprised herself with the vehemence of her response. "I mean, I don't think that would be wise. The horse's presence seems to be beneficial to the baby's state." Marcus's eyes narrowed. "Are you seriously suggesting we keep a horse in a hospital room? Have you lost your mind, Peterson?" Lucia stood her ground, even as doubt gnawed at her. Was she losing her mind? Was her usually rational thinking being clouded by the strangeness of the situation? "I'm suggesting," she said carefully, "that we need to consider all factors in Elias's care. And right now, Orion seems to be a positive factor." The tension in the room was palpable as Lucia and Marcus faced off. The other staff members watched nervously, unsure of how to react to this unprecedented situation. Finally, Marcus threw up his hands in exasperation. "Fine. Keep your magical horse. But when this all goes south, it's on your head, Peterson." He stormed out of the room, leaving a wake of uncomfortable silence behind him. Lucia let out a breath she hadn't realized she'd been holding. She knew this wasn't the end of her troubles. Marcus would undoubtedly report this to the hospital board, and she would have a lot of explaining to do. But as she looked at Elias, peacefully sleeping in his crib with Orion standing guard nearby, she knew she had made the right choice. There was something happening here that went beyond her medical training, beyond her understanding of the world. And she was determined to see it through, wherever it might lead. As the day turned to evening, Lucia found herself sitting in a chair next to Elias's crib, lost in thought. The baby was sleeping soundly, and Orion had settled into a corner, his watchful gaze never leaving the child. "What are you?" Lucia whispered, looking at Orion. "And why did you bring Elias here?" The horse's ear twitched at the sound of her voice, but otherwise, he remained still. Lucia sighed, rubbing her tired eyes. She knew she wouldn't find answers to her questions tonight, maybe not ever. But she was beginning to accept that some things in this world might always remain a mystery. As she settled in for a long night of observation, Lucia realized that this experience had already changed her. She had always prided herself on her rational, scientific approach to medicine. But now, faced with something that defied all logical explanation, she was learning to embrace uncertainty, to open her mind to possibilities she had never before considered. Whatever challenges lay ahead, whatever consequences she might face for her decisions today, Lucia knew one thing for certain. The arrival of Elias and Orion had set in motion a chain of events that would transform not just her life, but the entire town of Aurora Springs. And she was determined to see it through, no matter where this extraordinary journey might lead. The story progresses with moral dilemmas. Lucia questions whether she should follow rigid medical guidelines or listen to the intuition that leads her to believe something greater is at stake. Tensions rise when an old rival, Dr. Marcus, appears to criticize her choices. He represents the relentless logic that opposes the faith and connection Lucia begins to feel. As the sun began to set outside Aurora Springs General Hospital, casting long shadows across the floors of the pediatric ward, Dr. Lucia Peterson found herself at a crossroads. The events of the day had shaken her to her core, challenging everything she thought she knew about medicine, science, and the nature of reality itself. Elias slept peacefully in his crib, his tiny chest rising and falling with each breath. Orion stood vigilant nearby, his presence a constant source of comfort to the child and an ongoing puzzle to the medical staff. Lucia sat in a chair between them, her mind racing as she tried to reconcile her years of training with the inexplicable phenomena she had witnessed. A soft knock on the door jolted her from her thoughts. Sarah, the night nurse, poked her head in. "Dr. Peterson? There's a call for you at the nurse's station." "It's Dr. Brennan." Lucia sighed, knowing this confrontation was inevitable. Dr. Marcus Brennan, the head of pediatrics and her longtime professional rival, had made his disapproval clear earlier. Now, it seemed, he was ready to escalate the situation. "I'll be right there," Lucia said, rising from her chair. She cast one last glance at Elias and Orion before stepping out into the hallway. The fluorescent lights buzzed overhead as Lucia made her way to the nurse's station, her footsteps echoing in the quiet corridor. She picked up the phone, steeling herself for the conversation ahead. "This is Dr. Peterson," she said, her voice steady despite her inner turmoil. "Lucia, what the hell do you think you're doing?" Marcus's voice crackled through the receiver, his tone a mixture of anger and disbelief. "I've just gotten off the phone with the hospital board. They're in an uproar over this circus you've created." Lucia took a deep breath, choosing her words carefully. "Marcus, I understand your concerns, but this is an unprecedented situation. We're dealing with something beyond our current understanding of medicine." "Beyond our understanding?" Marcus scoffed. "Do you hear yourself, Lucia? You're one of the most rational doctors I know. Or at least, you were. Now you're talking about mystical connections between a baby and a horse. Have you lost your mind?" His words stung, hitting at the very doubts that had been plaguing Lucia all day. Had she lost her mind? Was she throwing away years of scientific training for what could be nothing more than an elaborate hoax or a series of coincidences? "I know how it sounds," Lucia said, fighting to keep her voice level. "But if you had seen what I've seen today, if you had witnessed the connection between Elias and Orion..." "Orion?" Marcus interrupted. "You've named the horse now?" That's not important," Lucia stammered, realizing how it must sound. "What's important is that separating them could be detrimental to Elias's health. Every time we've tried to move Orion, Elias's vitals have become erratic. There's a bond there that we don't understand, But it's real, Marcus. I've seen it with my own eyes. There was a long pause on the other end of the line. When Marcus spoke again, his voice was low and dangerous. Listen to me very carefully, Lucia. You are treading on thin ice. The board is talking about an emergency meeting to discuss your fitness to practice. You need to end this nonsense now, before it destroys your career. Lucia felt a chill run down her spine. She had known there would be consequences for her actions, but the reality of it hit her hard. Everything she had worked for, her entire professional life, was hanging in the balance. What would you have me do, Marcus? She asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Ignore what I've seen. Potentially harm a patient because it doesn't fit with our current understanding of medicine? I would have you be a doctor, Marcus snapped. Follow protocols, stick to established medical practices. That horse is a health hazard, and keeping it in a hospital room is a violation of countless regulations. Remove it, now, or I'll be forced to take more drastic measures. The line went dead before Lucia could respond. She slowly placed the receiver back in its cradle, her mind whirling with the implications of Marcus's threat. As she made her way back to Elias's room, Lucia found herself torn between her professional obligations and the undeniable connection she had witnessed between the baby and the horse. The rational part of her mind screamed that Marcus was right, that she was risking everything on what could be nothing more than an elaborate illusion. But another part of her, a part that had awakened today and grown stronger with each passing hour, told her that what she was witnessing was real. It was something beyond the scope of current medical science, yes, but no less valid for its inexplicability. Lucia paused outside Elias's room, her hand on the door handle. Through the small window, she could see Orion standing guard over the sleeping infant. The scene was so peaceful, so right, that it made her heart ache. Taking a deep breath, Lucia pushed open the door and stepped inside. As if sensing her turmoil, Orion turned his head to look at her, his dark eyes seeming to peer into her very soul. "What am I going to do?" Lucia whispered, more to herself than to the horse. As if in response, Elias stirred in his sleep, letting out a small whimper. Immediately, Orion moved closer to the crib, nickering softly. The baby settled almost instantly, a small smile playing on his lips. Watching this interaction, Lucia felt something shift inside her. The doubts that had been plaguing her began to recede, replaced by a certainty that transcended logic and reason. She thought back to why she had become a doctor in the first place. It wasn't for the prestige or the accolades. It was to help people, to heal them, to do what was best for her patients regardless of the personal cost. With newfound resolve, Lucia walked over to the crib and placed a gentle hand on Elias's forehead. "I don't know what's going on here," she said softly, "but I promise you, I'm going to figure it out. And I'm going to do whatever it takes to keep you safe and healthy." She turned to Orion, meeting his gaze. "Both of you." Just then, Sarah the nurse burst into the room, her face flushed with excitement. "Dr. Peterson, you need to come quickly. There's something you need to see." Lucia followed Sarah out into the hallway, her heart racing. As they rounded the corner, she stopped short, her eyes widening in disbelief. The corridor was filled with people. Patients from other wards, some in wheelchairs, others leaning on 4 poles, had gathered outside Elias's room. Among them were visitors, hospital staff, and even a few people Lucia recognized from town. "What's going on?" Lucia asked, her voice barely above a whisper. An elderly patient in a bathrobe stepped forward, his eyes shining. "We've come to see the miracle baby," he said. Word spread through the whole hospital. "They say he was brought here by an angel in the form of a horse." Lucia looked around at the crowd, seeing hope and wonder on every face. She realized then that what was happening here was bigger than her career or the hospital board. It was something that was touching the entire community, bringing light to a town that had long since lost its spark. As she stood there, caught between the world of science she had always known and the realm of miracles she was just beginning to understand, Lucia made her decision. Whatever challenges lay ahead, whatever price she might have to pay, she would stand by Elias and Orion. She would fight for them, protect them, and in doing so, perhaps discover truths about the world and herself that she had never dreamed possible. With a deep breath, Lucia turned back to the crowd. "All right," she said, her voice strong and clear. "Let me tell you about Elias and Orion." As she began to speak, Lucia felt a weight lift from her shoulders. She didn't have all the answers, but she had faith, in herself, in the connection she had witnessed, and in the power of compassion to overcome even the most rigid of boundaries. Whatever came next, she was ready to face it head-on. As the narrative unfolds, Orion becomes a symbol of protection and an invisible connection between living beings. He observes attentively from outside the hospital, as if waiting for a sign. The public finds themselves caught up in Lucia's emotions, her doubts, her hopes, and her personal growth as she discovers what truly matters in life. The news of the miraculous baby and his equine guardian spread through Aurora Springs like wildfire. By midday, a crowd had gathered outside the hospital, their faces pressed against the glass doors, hoping for a glimpse of Orion or any news about Elias. The normally quiet town was abuzz with excitement, speculation, and a renewed sense of wonder. Inside the hospital, Dr. Lucia Peterson found herself at the center of a storm. Her decision to allow Orion to stay with Elias had sparked controversy among her colleagues and caught the attention of the hospital administration. But as she watched the gentle interactions between the horse and the baby, she felt increasingly certain that she had made the right choice. Lucia stood by the window of Elias's room, looking out at the growing crowd. She could see familiar faces among them: Mr. Thompson, the baker, handing out free pastries; Emma Johnson, the librarian, reading stories to a group of children seated on the hospital lawn; even Mayor Wilson, trying to maintain some semblance of order while clearly caught up in the excitement himself. "It's quite a scene out there," a voice said behind her. Lucia turned to see Sarah, the night nurse who had first welcomed Orion and Elias into the hospital. Lucia nodded, a small smile playing on her lips. "It's like the whole town has come alive overnight." Sarah moved to stand beside her, her eyes scanning the crowd. "You know, I've lived in Aurora Springs my whole life, and I've never seen anything like this. It's as if people have remembered how to hope again." Lucia felt a lump form in her throat. She had been so focused on the medical aspects of the situation, on defending her decisions to her colleagues, that she hadn't fully grasped the impact this event was having on the town as a whole. "I never thought I'd say this," Sarah continued, her voice soft, "but that horse out there, he's not just protecting Elias. He's protecting all of us, in a way. Reminding us that there's still magic in the world, if we're willing to see it." As if on cue, Orion let out a soft nicker. Both women turned to see the horse gently nuzzling Elias, who had begun to stir in his crib. The baby's face broke into a toothless grin, his tiny hands reaching out to touch Orion's velvety muzzle. Lucia felt her heart swell at the sight. Despite all her years of medical training, all her reliance on hard science and empirical evidence, she couldn't deny the profound connection she was witnessing. It defied explanation, yet it was undeniably real. Just then, Dr. Marcus Brennan burst into the room, his face flushed with anger. "Peterson, what is the meaning of this circus outside? Do you have any idea what you've done?" Lucia straightened her back, ready to defend her actions once again. But before she could speak, Sarah stepped forward. "With all due respect, Dr. Brennan," she said, her voice firm despite her obvious nervousness, "Dr. Peterson has done something remarkable here. She's given this town something to believe in." Marcus scoffed, but Lucia could see a flicker of uncertainty in his eyes. "Belief? We're doctors, not faith healers. We deal in facts, in science, not in whatever this is." "Perhaps," Lucia said quietly, "there are some things that science can't fully explain yet. But that doesn't make them any less real." She gestured towards Elias and Orion. "Look at them, Marcus. Really look. Can you honestly say there's nothing extraordinary happening here?" Marcus's gaze moved from Lucia to the unlikely pair in the corner of the room. For a moment, his stern expression softened, replaced by something that looked almost like wonder. But then he shook his head, as if clearing away an unwelcome thought. "The board meeting is in an hour," he said, his voice gruff. "I hope you're prepared to face the consequences of your actions, Lucia." With that, he turned on his heel and left the room. As the door closed behind him, Lucia let out a breath she hadn't realized she'd been holding. The confrontation with Marcus had shaken her, bringing all her doubts rushing back to the surface. Was she really doing the right thing? Was she throwing away her career for nothing more than a beautiful illusion? But as she looked at Elias, peacefully cradled in Orion's protective presence, she felt her resolve strengthen once more. Whatever happened in that board meeting, she would stand by her decision. She would fight for what she believed in, even if it meant standing alone against the entire medical establishment. The hours leading up to the board meeting passed in a blur. Lucia spent the time checking on Elias, conferring with the pediatric team, and preparing her defense. All the while, Orion stood watchful, his calm presence a stark contrast to the tension that filled the hospital corridors. As the time for the meeting approached, Lucia found herself standing once again by the window, looking out at the crowd that had only grown larger as the day wore on. She could see television news vans parked at the edges of the hospital grounds, reporters jostling for position. The story of the miracle baby and his equine guardian had clearly captured imaginations far beyond the borders of Aurora Springs. "Dr. Peterson?" Sarah's voice pulled her from her thoughts. "It's time." Lucia nodded, taking a deep breath to steady herself. She cast one last look at Elias and Orion, drawing strength from their unwavering bond. Then, squaring her shoulders, she followed Sarah out of the room. The walk to the conference room felt like the longest of Lucia's life. As she passed through the hospital corridors, she was acutely aware of the eyes following her, some curious, some supportive, others disapproving. But she kept her gaze forward, focused on the challenge ahead. Outside the conference room, she paused, her hand on the door handle. In that moment, she felt the full weight of her decision pressing down on her. Everything she had worked for, her entire career, could end today. But as she thought of Elias, of Orion, of the hope they had brought to Aurora Springs, she knew she couldn't back down now. With a deep breath, Lucia pushed open the door and stepped inside. The room fell silent as she entered, all eyes turning to her. At the head of the table sat Dr. Harriet Simmons, the hospital's chief of staff, her face unreadable. Beside her was Marcus, a triumphant gleam in his eyes. The rest of the board members regarded Lucia with expressions ranging from curiosity to open hostility. "Dr. Peterson," Dr. Simmons said, her voice cool and professional, "I believe you know why we've called this meeting. Your actions over the past 24 hours have raised serious concerns about your judgment and your fitness to practice medicine at this institution." Lucia nodded, her voice steady as she replied, "I understand, Dr. Simmons. And I'm prepared to defend my decisions." "Very well," Dr. Simmons said, leaning back in her chair. "Please, explain to us why you believe it was appropriate to allow a horse, an animal with no medical training or certification, to remain in close proximity to a vulnerable infant in our pediatric ward." Lucia took a deep breath, gathering her thoughts. She had rehearsed this moment countless times in her head, but now that it was here, she found herself discarding her prepared speech. Instead, she spoke from her heart. "Colleagues, I stand before you today not just as a doctor, but as a witness to something truly extraordinary. What I've seen over the past day defies easy explanation, but it is no less real for its inexplicability." She went on to describe the undeniable bond between Elias and Orion, the positive effects on the baby's health, and the ripple of hope that had spread through the entire town. "I know that what I'm describing falls outside the bounds of our current medical understanding," Lucia concluded, her voice filled with passion. "But isn't that how medicine advances? By being open to new possibilities, by questioning our assumptions, by daring to believe in miracles." As Lucia finished speaking, a hush fell over the room. She could see the board members exchanging glances, some thoughtful, others skeptical. Dr. Simmons's face remained impassive, giving no hint of her thoughts. Just as the silence was becoming unbearable, there was a commotion outside the conference room. The door burst open, and Sarah rushed in, her face flushed with excitement. "I'm sorry to interrupt," she gasped, "but you all need to see this. It's Elias and Orion. Something's happening." Without waiting for a response, Sarah turned and ran back down the corridor. After a moment of stunned silence, the entire board, led by Dr. Simmons, rose and followed her. As they approached Elias's room, Lucia could hear a collective gasp from the crowd that had gathered in the hallway. Pushing her way to the front, she stopped short at the sight that greeted her. Elias was sitting up in his crib, something he shouldn't have been able to do at his age. And there, shimmering in the air around him and Orion, was a soft, golden light. It pulsed gently, seeming to connect the baby and the horse in a tangible, visible bond. Lucia turned to see Dr. Simmons and the rest of the board staring in awe at the scene before them. In that moment, she knew that everything had changed. Whatever happened next, the world would never be quite the same. As the golden light filled the room, Lucia felt a profound sense of peace wash over her. She had taken a stand for what she believed in, had fought for Elias and Orion against all odds. And now, in this moment of miracle, she knew that she had discovered what truly mattered in life: compassion, faith, and the courage to believe in something greater than oneself. Finally, when all seems lost and Elias is on the brink of death, an unexpected event occurs. Orion, in a surprising gesture, enters the emergency room, drawn by the strength of the bond he formed with the baby. He positions himself beside the bed, and in a moment of pure connection, Lucia realizes that Orion's presence triggers a miraculous reaction. The life energy emanating from the horse seems to revitalize Elias, inexplicably bringing him back to life. The golden light that had enveloped Elias and Orion slowly faded, leaving the room in a state of stunned silence. Dr. Simmons was the first to speak, her voice barely above a whisper. "Dr. Peterson, I don't know what to say. In all my years of medicine, I've never seen anything like this." Lucia nodded, her eyes still fixed on Elias and Orion. "None of us have, Dr. Simmons. We're in uncharted territory here." The peaceful moment was suddenly shattered by a high-pitched beeping from one of the monitors attached to Elias. Lucia's heart dropped as she saw the baby's vitals plummeting rapidly. "He's crashing," she yelled, rushing to the crib. "I need a crash cart in here, now." The room erupted into chaos. Nurses and doctors poured in, pushing past the stunned board members. Lucia worked feverishly, her hands moving with practiced precision as she fought to stabilize Elias. "Come on, little one," she muttered, her voice tight with fear and determination. "Stay with us." But despite their best efforts, Elias's condition continued to deteriorate. His tiny body convulsed, his skin taking on a bluish tinge as he struggled to breathe. In the midst of the frenzy, Orion had been pushed to the corner of the room. The horse snickered anxiously, his eyes never leaving Elias. Lucia glanced up, meeting Orion's gaze, and in that moment, she felt a surge of something. An idea, an instinct, a desperate hope. "Move back," she commanded, her voice cutting through the chaos. "Everyone, step away from the crib." Dr. Simmons looked at her in disbelief. "Dr. Peterson, what are you doing?" "Trust me," Lucia said, her eyes blazing with determination. "Please, just trust me." To her surprise, Dr. Simmons nodded, gesturing for the others to move back. As the medical team retreated, Lucia turned to Orion. "Come," she said softly, holding out her hand. "He needs you." For a moment, Orion didn't move. Then, with a grace that belied his size, he stepped forward. The room fell silent as the massive horse made his way to Elias's crib, his hooves clicking softly on the linoleum floor. Orion lowered his head, gently nuzzling Elias's still form. For a heartbeat, nothing happened. Then, slowly, a soft glow began to emanate from where Orion's muzzle touched Elias's skin. The glow spread, enveloping both the horse and the baby in a cocoon of warm, golden light. Lucia watched in awe as Elias's vitals began to stabilize. Color returned to his cheeks, and his breathing evened out. It's impossible," Dr. Marcus Brennan muttered, his earlier skepticism forgotten in the face of the miracle unfolding before them. But Lucia knew it wasn't impossible. Improbable, yes. Unexplainable by current medical science, certainly. But not impossible. She had seen the bond between Elias and Orion from the beginning, had felt in her heart that there was something special, something profound in their connection. As the minutes ticked by, Elias's condition continued to improve. The monitors that had been screaming in alarm now beeped steadily, showing strong, healthy vitals. When Orion finally lifted his head, Elias's eyes fluttered open. The baby gurgled happily, reaching out towards the horse with tiny, grasping hands. Lucia stepped forward, her medical training kicking in as she began to examine Elias. But even as she checked his vitals and responses, she knew in her heart that he was fine. More than fine, he was thriving. "I've never seen anything like this," she said, her voice filled with wonder. "It's as if Orion somehow transferred his own life energy to Elias." Dr. Simmons moved to stand beside her, her eyes wide as she looked from Elias to Orion and back again. "Dr. Peterson, I owe you an apology. When you spoke of the connection between this child and this horse, I thought you had lost your scientific objectivity. But now..." Lucia smiled, understanding the older woman's struggle to reconcile what she was seeing with her years of medical knowledge. "It's all right, Dr. Simmons. I've been grappling with the same thing since Orion first brought Elias to us. Sometimes, we have to be willing to accept that there are things in this world that we don't yet understand." As the initial shock wore off, the room began to buzz with excited conversation. Doctors and nurses huddled in small groups, discussing what they had witnessed. The board members, who had come to potentially end Lucia's career, now looked at her with a mixture of respect and awe. In the midst of it all, Lucia felt a gentle touch on her arm. She turned to see Sarah, the night nurse, her eyes shining with unshed tears. "You did it, Dr. Peterson," Sarah said softly. "You believed when no one else would. You gave Elias a chance at life." Lucia shook her head, her gaze drawn back to Orion and Elias. "No, Sarah. We all did this. Every person who believed, who hoped, who was willing to open their minds to possibilities beyond our current understanding, we all played a part in this miracle." As the day wore on, news of Elias's miraculous recovery spread through the hospital and beyond. The crowd outside the hospital grew, their faces alight with joy and wonder. Reporters clamored for interviews, desperate to share this extraordinary story with the world. But inside Elias's room, a bubble of calm persisted. Lucia sat in a chair by the crib, watching as Orion stood guard over the sleeping baby. The horse's presence, once so out of place in the sterile hospital environment, now seemed as natural and necessary as any piece of medical equipment. Dr. Simmons entered the room quietly, coming to stand beside Lucia. For a moment, they both watched Elias sleep, his tiny chest rising and falling with each peaceful breath. "Dr. Peterson," Dr. Simmons said at last, "I came here today prepared to suspend you, possibly even to revoke your medical license. Instead, I find myself wondering if we're standing on the brink of a new frontier in medicine." Lucia looked up at her, surprised. "What do you mean?" Dr. Simmons smiled, a glimmer of excitement in her eyes. "What we've witnessed here today, this connection between Elias and Orion, this transfer of life energy, it challenges everything we thought we knew about healing. It opens up possibilities we never dreamed of." She paused, her gaze thoughtful. "I'm proposing a new research initiative, Dr. Peterson. A study into the healing bond between humans and animals, with you at the helm. That is, if you're interested." Lucia felt her heart skip a beat. The opportunity being offered to her was beyond anything she had ever imagined. But as she looked at Elias and Orion, she knew her answer. "I'm honored, Dr. Simmons, truly. But my place is here, with Elias and Orion. There's still so much we don't understand about their connection, about the miracle we witnessed today. I need to be here, to observe, to learn." Dr. Simmons nodded, a knowing smile on her face. "I thought you might say that." "Very well, Dr. Peterson. Your primary focus will be Elias and Orion, but I hope you'll consider sharing your observations with our research team. What happened here today could change the face of medicine as we know it." As Dr. Simmons left the room, Lucia turned back to Elias and Orion. The baby was awake now, cooing softly as he reached out towards the horse. Orion lowered his head, allowing Elias to pat his velvety muzzle. Watching them, Lucia felt a profound sense of peace wash over her. She didn't know what the future held, what challenges and discoveries lay ahead. But she knew that she was exactly where she was meant to be, bearing witness to a miracle that defied explanation but offered hope beyond measure. As the sun began to set outside, painting the sky in hues of gold and pink, Lucia settled in for another night of observation. But this night was different from all the others. Tonight, she watched not just as a doctor, but as a believer in miracles, in the power of connection, and in the endless possibilities that lay in the space between what we know and what we have yet to discover.